counter-terrorism efforts have led to a general decline in terrorist activity in Indonesia. There has been a decrease in the frequency of attacks and the operational capabilities of major terrorist groups. Indonesia experienced 0 terrorist attacks in 2024. But there is an increasing concern about some individuals previously arrested for terrorism re-engaging in extremist activities. I don't know the recent development in Syria, how it will impact to Southeast Asia. I am not sure which nations are funding them. Anyway, the world is connecting with each other. I hope nothing happens. Today's podcast is about terrorism landscape using with RSS latest report and focus on Southeast Asia. Stay tuned and stay safe.
All right, so we've got this mountain of reports and analyses on global terrorism trends for 2025. A lot of it seems to be focused on Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular.
Yeah, you've got some great material there. A lot of good stuff from the RSIS. Those folks really know their stuff when it comes to the region.
Yeah, their name keeps popping up. One thing that really jumped out at me was that statistic about over 90% of terrorist attacks taking place in active conflict zones.
Yeah.
That's a pretty huge number. It makes you wonder if maybe ending the conflicts should be our top priority, right?
It really underlines that link between conflict and terrorism for sure.
Yeah.
The RSIS reports, they really emphasize that, especially when you're looking at Southeast Asia. You've got places like the Philippines and Thailand with these ongoing conflicts, and it creates this this breeding ground for terrorist groups.
And things aren't exactly peaceful on the global stage either.
Yeah.
The conflict in Gaza seems to be having a pretty big impact, even as far away as Southeast Asia.
Oh, absolutely. That's a major point in a lot of these reports. The conflict feeds this sense of resentment and anger that extremist groups can really exploit. Plus, you've got the rise of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, in Syria. They've got connections to al-Qaeda, and their resurgence is making the global terrorism landscape even more complicated.
Speaking of complicated, the RSIS reports seem to paint a kind of a mixed picture in Southeast Asia. On the one hand, you've got the threat from ISIS-affiliated groups decreasing because of all the successful counterterrorism operations. But then on the other hand...
Well, yeah, then you've got this whole other set of challenges popping up. Self-radicalization is increasing, and so is radicalization within families. And of course, the internet is still a major tool for spreading extremist ideologies.
It's kind of like whack-a-mole, isn't it? You knock down one threat, and 2 more spring up to take its place. That online element seems especially hard to deal with.
It really is. You look at a group like Jemaah Islamiyah, JI, in Indonesia, they might have officially disbanded, but the ideology is still around, spreading through online channels. And it's not just individuals anymore. We're seeing whole families getting radicalized together.
Now, speaking of Indonesia, they seem to be a major focus in these reports. They saw a decrease in terrorism-related arrests in 2024. In fact, it was their lowest number in 5 years. Does that mean things are actually getting better over there?
Well, it's easy to think that, but the RSIS is warning against complacency. The Indonesian authorities have been really active, targeting important figures within groups like JI and Jemaah Ansarud Daulah, JAD. They're definitely breaking up networks, but the threat hasn't disappeared completely.
That's a little unsettling, especially with those reports talking about concerns over potential attacks, even mentioning stuff like double suicide bombings, targeting places of worship. Kind of sends chills down your spine, you know.
It definitely reminds us that even with successful counterterrorism efforts, we can't let our guard down. Indonesia is taking this seriously, though. They've got that national action plan to fight extremism, and they're making their counterterrorism policies more decentralized, trying to be more effective at the local level.
That local approach seems to be a bit of a recurring theme. The Philippines, for example, they're relying a lot on local communities to help with the rehabilitation and reintegration of former combatants. Makes sense, right? Who better to understand the complexities on the ground than the people who live there?
Exactly. And it's not just about reintegration. Those local communities, they can play a vital role in preventing radicalization in the first place. They're often the first to spot the warning signs and step in before someone goes down that path.
The Philippines have had some pretty impressive wins recently, haven't they? I was reading about how they've managed to weaken groups like the Abu Sayyaf group and the Daulah Islamiyah Mat group.
They've definitely had some success. They're using strategies like going after the leaders and encouraging surrender. But even with those victories, the Philippines still faces some unique challenges. You've got interclan wars, organized crime, and then there's this deep-rooted culture of revenge they call Rido. It just keeps fueling those cycles of violence.
So even as terrorism decreases, other forms of violence are filling the void. It's a good reminder that we're dealing with a complex problem here. There are no easy solutions.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a little, the reports also highlighted Malaysia. Seems there's been an uptick in IS-related terrorism there recently. What's behind that?
Well, one thing that makes Malaysia different is the role of self-radicalization in family networks. We saw it in that Ulu Tiram attack, where a whole family was involved in a planned terrorist act. It makes it incredibly difficult for the authorities to counter ideologies that are spreading through personal connections like that.
Especially with that online element adding fuel to the fire. It creates this echo chamber effect where extremist views can just fester and grow. How is Malaysia dealing with this particular challenge?
They're definitely not taking it lightly. Malaysian security forces are becoming more proactive, using technology and surveillance to try to identify and stop potential threats before they can actually happen. They're also working to counter extremist messages online and build stronger relationships with local communities to prevent radicalization.
Sounds like they're walking a tightrope there, trying to stay ahead of the game without stepping on individual liberties.
Hmm.
But it's not just a Malaysian issue, is it? That whole online radicalization thing seems to be a global headache.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of countries that take security seriously, Singapore comes to mind. Even though they're a small country, they've got a high terrorism threat assessment.
I was actually surprised by that. I mean, Singapore is known for its strict laws and efficient security forces, but even they've had cases of self-radicalization, with some coming dangerously close to becoming real attacks.
It just goes to show how far-reaching this threat really is. Singapore's response is interesting, though. They've got these comprehensive legal frameworks to fight terrorism financing, and they're investing a lot in cutting-edge technology for border security.
But it's not all about brute force, is it? I read about this group called the Religious Rehabilitation Group, the RRG. They work directly with individuals who've been radicalized. It's a more human approach, trying to get at the root causes of extremism.
It's a crucial part of their strategy, for sure. They recognize that simply arresting people isn't enough. You have to deal with the ideology itself and offer support to those who have been drawn into extremism.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Thailand's a whole different story, isn't it? They've got this ongoing conflict in the Deep South that seems incredibly complex.
It really is. The Barisan Revolusi Nasional, the BRN, is still active there, despite those peace talks. What makes this conflict so tough is the deep-seated nature of the grievances. There's a long history of marginalization and discrimination that fuels the violence.
It seems like there are no easy answers there. Trying to solve a conflict like that requires a really deep understanding of the historical, social, and political context, and it takes a willingness to make genuine compromises.
You've hit the nail on the head. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. But let's zoom out for a second and think about the wider implications of all these trends. The world is getting more and more interconnected, and what happens in one part of the world can ripple out and affect things globally.
For sure. And with the rise of non-state actors, groups like terrorists who operate across borders, it creates a whole new set of challenges for those traditional security structures. It's like trying to catch smoke.
That's a great analogy. And to make things even more complicated, you've got these major geopolitical shifts happening, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. These shifts can destabilize entire regions and create fertile ground for extremist groups to take root.
Speaking of destabilizing, one analyst even suggested that the current global situation could actually lead to a second Arab Spring. And if that happens, it could have huge implications for global security, right?
It's definitely a possibility we need to watch closely. The first Arab Spring showed us how quickly things can change and how unpredictable the fallout can be. The world is holding its breath, waiting to see what might happen next. And with the U.S. potentially becoming more isolationist under this new Trump administration, there's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to affect global counterterrorism efforts.
It's like everyone's on edge, waiting to see what's going to happen next. Will other countries step up if the U.S. pulls back? Or will it create an opportunity for groups like ISIS to exploit?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? The RSIS reports actually spend a good amount of time looking at the potential impact of these U.S. policy shifts on Southeast Asia. It's a complicated picture, with each country having different levels of exposure to the U.S. and different ways of dealing with them.
I'd imagine Indonesia, being the world's largest Muslim-majority country, is probably watching all this very closely, especially with those concerns about groups like JI and JAD still hanging around.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about pressure from outside. Indonesia's got its own internal struggles, like trying to find that balance between fighting terrorism and respecting human rights. They've had some controversies in the past with their approach, so they need to constantly make sure that their tactics are effective but also ethical.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. You've got to protect people from terrorism, but you can't do it by sacrificing their basic freedoms. It's a debate that's happening in democracies all around the world.
And not just democracies. Even authoritarian regimes are wrestling with this. Look at Singapore. They're known for their tough laws and tight control, but even they're having to adapt their approach to deal with the changing nature of terrorism.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that Singapore is investing in all sorts of high-tech security measures, but they also have that religious rehabilitation group working to counter extremism at the ideological level. It seems like a more well-rounded approach, recognizing that technology alone can't solve this problem.
Exactly. It's not just about changing people's minds, though. It's also about giving them alternatives.
Yeah.
A lot of these extremist groups prey on people who are marginalized or feel like they don't have opportunities. So part of the solution has to be about addressing those underlying social and economic factors.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
If you can give people a stake in society, a reason to believe in the future, they're less likely to be drawn to these destructive ideologies.
Absolutely. It's not a quick fix, though. The RSIS reports really stress the importance of long-term solutions like education, creating jobs, and promoting social cohesion. These are the things that will ultimately make societies more resilient to extremism.
It's a reminder that fighting terrorism isn't just about military actions or intelligence gathering. It's about building a world that's fairer and more just, where people don't feel like they have to resort to violence to make their voices heard.
Well said. And speaking of hearing different voices, let's turn our attention back to Malaysia for a moment. We touched on it earlier, this unique challenge they have with radicalization happening within families.
Yeah, that Ulu Tiram attack was a stark reminder of how hard it is to fight extremism when it's spreading within families. It's not like you can just arrest your way out of that problem.
Exactly. And this isn't just about parents brainwashing their kids. In a lot of cases, it's more about a shared sense of grievance or alienation that brings families together. Maybe they've faced discrimination or they feel like they're falling behind economically. Whatever the reason, these families turn inward and become more vulnerable to extremist narratives.
So how do you even begin to address something like that? It seems like such a sensitive and complex issue.
It is. There's no easy solution. But the RSIS report suggests that building trust is key. Law enforcement can't just go barging into these communities and start making arrests. They need to work with community leaders, religious figures, even family members themselves to try to understand the dynamics at play and develop strategies for intervention.
That sounds like a long and difficult process.
It definitely is, and it takes a lot of patience and cultural sensitivity. But the RSIS reports do point to some encouraging examples of how this can be done effectively. For instance, there are programs in Malaysia that work directly with families who have been affected by extremism. They offer counseling and support to help them break free from those harmful ideologies.
That's inspiring to hear that there are people out there working on these solutions, even though it's a slow and challenging process.
Absolutely. And it's not limited to Malaysia. There are similar initiatives happening in other Southeast Asian countries, as well as in Europe and North America. There's this growing realization that tackling extremism requires a multifaceted approach that addresses both individuals and the community as a whole.
Speaking of different approaches, we haven't talked much about Thailand. Their situation with the BRN in the Deep South seems like a whole different animal.
It really is. It's a conflict that's been simmering for decades, fueled by these deeply rooted historical grievances and a sense of marginalization among the Malay Muslim population in the South.
I read that they've been trying to hammer out a peace agreement for years, but it seems like every time they get close, something happens and the process gets derailed.
It is incredibly frustrating. It just shows how difficult it is to try and resolve conflicts that are based on these deeply ingrained historical and cultural divisions. And the BRN itself is not a unified group. You've got different factions with different goals and different levels of willingness to come to the table and talk.
Sounds like a tangled web with no easy way out. Is there any hope for a peaceful solution anytime soon?
It's tough to say for sure. The RSIS reports acknowledge all the complexities and challenges, but they do highlight some glimmers of hope. There are moderate voices on both sides that are dedicated to finding a peaceful way forward, and there's this growing understanding that a purely military approach just won't cut it when it comes to ending this conflict.
So what's the alternative? Can you address these underlying grievances without resorting to violence?
That's the million-dollar question. The RSIS report suggests that a lasting solution is going to require a combination of things: political reforms, economic reforms, and social reforms. It means giving the Malay Muslim population in the South more autonomy, more control over their own affairs. It also means dealing with those economic disparities that have fueled so much anger and frustration.
That sounds like a pretty tall order, but it's good to know that there are people working towards that goal.
Absolutely. And it's not just about governments and institutions either. Civil society organizations, religious leaders, regular citizens, they all have a part to play in building peace and fostering reconciliation.
It's a good reminder that even when faced with conflicts that seem impossible to resolve, there's always hope for a brighter future. We just got to be willing to put in the work to make it happen.
Well said. And speaking of working towards a better future, let's broaden our perspective again and think about the global implications of all these trends we've been discussing. We're living in a world that's more and more interconnected, where events in one part of the globe can have far-reaching consequences.
We've already talked about the possibility of a second Arab Spring and the uncertainty surrounding U.S. foreign policy. What other global trends are shaping the future of terrorism?
Well, one trend that's really grabbed the attention of experts is the rapid development of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, AI. AI has the potential to completely revolutionize so many things, from healthcare to transportation, but it can also be weaponized in dangerous ways.
That's a scary thought. Are we talking about AI-powered terrorism?
It's definitely a possibility that we need to be ready for. Terrorist groups could use AI to develop more advanced weapons, plan more elaborate attacks, and spread propaganda more effectively. They could even use AI to pinpoint individuals for recruitment or attack based on their online activity.
That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. But then again, science fiction has a way of becoming reality these days.
It sure does. And the speed at which technology is changing is only getting faster. The good news is that AI can also be used to fight terrorism. Security agencies all over the world are already using AI to analyze data, identify potential threats, and disrupt terrorist networks.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword then. AI could make terrorism more dangerous, but it could also give us new tools to fight back.
You got it. And the outcome really depends on who wins this AI arms race. Governments and security agencies need to invest heavily in developing AI capabilities for counterterrorism purposes. They also need to work with the private sector to ensure that AI technology is developed and used responsibly.
That's a huge challenge, but one that we can't ignore. The future of global security may very well depend on it.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of the future, let's wrap up this deep dive by thinking about what all this means for the average person. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the doom and gloom, but there are things we can all do to make a difference.
Good point. We can't just sit back and wait for the governments to solve this for us. What are some practical steps we can take to protect ourselves in our communities?
Well, the most important thing is to be aware of the threat. That means staying informed about what's going on in the world, paying attention to current events, and being alert to potential signs of extremism in our own communities.
So basically, don't bury our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about the threat, the better prepared we'll be to protect ourselves.
What else can we do?
We can also focus on building stronger communities. Terrorism thrives on division and fear. The more connected we are to our neighbors, the less likely we are to fall prey to these extremist ideologies.
So things like volunteering, joining local organizations, and just generally being a good neighbor can actually help prevent terrorism.
For sure. It's all about fostering a sense of belonging and having shared goals. When people feel connected to their community, they're less likely to be drawn to extremist groups that offer a false sense of belonging.
That's a really powerful message. It means that even the smallest acts of kindness and connection can have a ripple effect, making our communities safer and more resilient.
Absolutely. And finally, we can all support organizations that are working to counter extremism and promote peace. There are so many NGOs and charities out there doing incredible work on the front lines.
So donating our time or money can actually make a real difference.
You bet. Every little bit counts. And by supporting these organizations, we're not just fighting terrorism. We're investing in a more peaceful and just world for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. This deep dive has been so informative, but also a little overwhelming at times. It's comforting to know that there are things we can all do to make a difference.
I agree. And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. The more we talk about these issues, the better prepared we'll be to face the challenges that lie ahead.
Feels like we've gone pretty deep down this rabbit hole. Started with these reports about terrorism in Southeast Asia, and now we're talking about global AI arms races and the future of humanity.
Well, that's the thing about terrorism, isn't it? It's not just some regional problem. It's a global thing with deep roots and complicated implications. And as technology keeps advancing, the threat is only getting more complex and more interconnected.
Okay, but let's circle back to Southeast Asia for a sec. We've covered Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. Any other countries in the region that we should be talking about?
The RSIS reports do mention a few others, but they're not really front and center in the analysis. Brunei, for example, they have a relatively low terrorism threat level, but they're still keeping an eye out, especially since they're so close to Malaysia and Indonesia.
And what about Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia? They've had their share of conflict, but they don't seem to come up much in these discussions about terrorism.
Well, that's because the nature of the threat in those countries is a bit different. They're more worried about internal security issues, stuff like political dissent and ethnic tensions, rather than terrorism that crosses borders.
So it's not that they're immune to terrorism, but it's not their main concern. Their security focus is more internal.
Exactly, and that highlights something important. Terrorism isn't this one-size-fits-all threat. It takes different forms in different places, and the solutions have to be tailored to fit.
It's like that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You can't just use the same counterterrorism strategy everywhere and expect it to work.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to have organizations like the RSIS doing this kind of deep analysis. They help us understand all the little details of the threat and come up with more effective strategies for countering it.
Speaking of effective strategies, what are the experts saying about the future of counterterrorism? Is there any kind of agreement on what works best?
Well, as you can imagine, there's no magic bullet. But the RSIS reports do point to a few key principles that seem to be emerging as best practices.
Okay, I'm listening.
First off, there's a growing emphasis on prevention. That means getting to the root causes of extremism: poverty, inequality, discrimination. It also means working to counter extremist ideologies, both online and offline.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys after the fact. It's about stopping them from becoming bad guys in the first place.
Right. And that requires a whole of society approach. It's not just the government's job, it's everyone's responsibility.
What else is on that list of best practices?
There's also a growing recognition that community engagement is crucial. Law enforcement can't do this alone. They need to work with local communities to build trust, share information, and come up with solutions that are tailored to the specific needs of that community.
It's about building bridges instead of walls.
Exactly. And lastly, there's a growing focus on rehabilitation and reintegration. It's not enough to just lock up terrorists and throw away the key. We have to find ways to help them turn away from extremism and become contributing members of society again.
This sounds pretty challenging. How do you de-radicalize someone who's been completely indoctrinated by these extremist ideologies?
It's definitely not easy. But there are programs out there that have shown some promise. They use a combination of counseling, education, and vocational training. The goal is to help these individuals develop critical thinking skills, question their extremist beliefs, and ultimately build a new life for themselves.
It's like giving them a second chance, an opportunity to break free from that cycle of violence.
That's it. And it's not just about the individuals themselves. It's about sending a message to others who might be thinking about joining extremist groups. It shows them there's a way out, that there's hope for a different kind of future.
That's a powerful message. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with Southeast Asia and ended up talking about the trends that are shaping the future of terrorism all over the world.
It's been a fascinating journey, but I think the biggest takeaway is this. Terrorism is a complicated and constantly changing threat, but it's not unbeatable. By working together, by understanding the nuances of the threat, and by taking a comprehensive approach, we can make the world a safer place.
That's a message I can definitely get behind. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure. It's been great.